Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
This is Lindsay Smith Rogers. Today, Stephanie Desmond talks to Heather Price, a climate scientist and one of the creators of Talk Climate, an online resource designed to help people of all ages have productive, courageous, and empowering conversations about climate change. They discuss why age-appropriate content is so valuable at this key moment in the climate crisis. Let's listen. Heather Price, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Stephanie.
I want to talk to you today about an initiative that you've started called Talk Climate. But first, I want you to tell me and your listeners a little bit about your background and how you ended up here.
Yes, I'm a climate scientist by training, an atmospheric chemist. I did my postdoc with the program on climate change at University of Washington, working on global chemical transport models, looking at what would happen if we went to a hydrogen economy. And my PhD, I studied air pollution, of which much of our air pollution is fossil fueled. It is connected to climate. So I've been working in the climate sphere since the late 90s. And now I teach chemistry. I'm a chemistry professor, and I weave climate all through my teaching and in the work that I do with students, and also on the board of Climate Action Families. We discovered that the way that we talk with kids really depends on how old they are, how ready they are, what questions they have, their curiosity. And so I started working with mental health professionals such as Megan Slade, Daniel Masler, and Leslie Davenport, who specialize in climate anxiety, particularly in youth. And so we met up during the 2019 climate strikes that were inspired by Greta Thunberg and youth such as Jamie Margolin. And we worked with psychologists and climate scientists to help bridge the communication and the way that scientists and caregivers talk with kids and young adults about climate, and helping people like me who are scientists to do this in a way that is trauma-informed, that is protective of youth emotions, but also honest. We've been doing this work together since about 2019 when Megan and I and Daniel began Talk Climate.
So I guess the first question I have is, why is it so hard for us to talk about climate change?
I think part of it is that there's a lot of silence around climate. You don't hear about it in the news nearly as much as we should be hearing about it. It is a crisis. I think part of it is avoidance. People don't like to hear bad news, but there's also a lot of good news out there around climate and the potential for good news to happen. Things around electrification, around how electrification, as it replaces fossil fuels, is going to save lives. The Harvard's Chan School of Public Health had a study come out that said 8 million people are dying prematurely because of fossil-fueled air pollution. That's not even talking about other climate impacts such as flooding and heat waves and smoke that are killing people. This is just the fossil-fueled air pollution. And so as we electrify, it is going to be a wildly cleaner, safer, healthier world for us and for our children. And so I think shifting that narrative is really helpful, and pointing the news, hey, what could be? How can it be positive? But it's a lot of gloom and doom, I think, in the news when we do hear about what's happening with science. And yeah, it is very distressing. It's distressing for me. I don't read scientific articles on climate at night because I will lose sleep. So I protect myself as well. And so I think it's important for us to do that with the young people we work with too.
So they're feeling some anxiety about this.
I think so.
Tell me more about that.
Yeah, I think the youth are feeling anxiety around it. And it's interesting, the youth who are feeling anxiety around this. There's a big difference between youth who are active and youth who are not. Yale School of Public Health, a coalition of researchers, just published a study showing that anxiety related to climate change was linked to symptoms of depression, but only among students who did not engage in group activities to address climate change. So taking action really does have protective effects for youth who are involved. And this was for youth in college and graduate programs. Now, for younger people, I think, at least my own experience, I have 2 teenagers in my home. And one of my teenagers, this was, I think in 2019 or 2020, she came to me and said, "Hey, Mom, one of my friends said that she's losing sleep over climate change." And she asked me, "Am I losing sleep?" And this was after I prompted her. I said, "Well, what did you say? Are you worried about that?" And she's like, "Oh, no, my friend asked me that." And I said, "No, my mom's working on that. I'm a little worried about it, but my mom's working on that." And so having adults in your life for young people is also protective if those adults are taking action. So my children see me giving testimony, giving interviews like this, taking part in actions. And that particular child of mine, she is not a climate activist. And yet it's something she cares about, something she knows about, but she doesn't feel a lot of anxiety.
So why did you create this Talk Climate?
The Talk Climate organization came out of the 2019 climate strikes. So the big climate strikes with millions of people around the world in September of 2019. And I was organizing a Ask a Climate Scientist space at the Seattle Climate Strike, where youth and members of the public could come and talk with climate scientists. Being a climate scientist myself, I have a wide network at University of Washington and locally, including Physicians for Social Responsibility, because climate really does touch so many areas. I gathered and sent out an invitation to a number of the scientists that I know and mental health and medical health professionals who are familiar with climate and its impacts to join me at this space to be able to answer the questions from people in the audience. My friend Megan Slade, who I know through Climate Action Families, she reached out to me and said, "Hey, we should have these scientists talk with psychologists, child psychologists such as Daniel Masler and Megan about how to talk with kids about climate in ways that is supportive of their emotional health, is encouraging and inspiring, that isn't doom and gloom." And so Daniel and Megan and I met with those climate scientists who wanted to be part of this tent, the space at the climate strike, and just went through ideas for how do you talk with climate if it's a 5-year-old asking you questions versus a 14-year-old versus a 24-year-old. It's very similar to when you talk with kids about a sick family member. If grandma is sick, you're going to talk with a 4-year-old very differently than you are with a 14-year-old or a 24-year-old in your life, right? For the 4-year-old, it's all about, let's go bake cookies for grandma and go visit her and spend some time with her or play in the garden. For the 14-year-old, they might be curious about what are the health impacts with grandma. The 16 or 17-year-old might also be interested in what is the science behind her diagnosis and might want to know more about the medical issues that are going on. And then the 24-year-old, depending on how much they want to know. So it's very age-based and also developmentally based. So one 8-year-old might be ready for the science. Another 8-year-old is going to say, "Wait, I'm not ready for talking about this yet," and meeting the kids and the young adults, whoever they are, where they are.
And so you created online resources that anyone can access. Tell me about that.
Yes, we created a resource hub because we were finding there's so many resources out there around climate. And so if you go to our Talk Climate website, we have a number of different tabs about how to talk climate with children, and we have them broken up into birth to kindergarten, elementary school, middle to high school, young adults, and then special spaces for caregivers and adults. And then we have climate resources specifically targeted for education, focused on environmental justice. And there's a number of links to articles, books. We try to be really careful about the articles that we point to, that they do not have a paywall. And so we'll often ask permission from the authors if we can just take that piece. So we're constantly vetting this and updating it. There's also tabs within the resources on faith and spirituality, healthcare, public health, mental health and well-being, and then the science side. And we have a number of handouts. Some of the more popular handouts are Talk Climate infographic, which is the do's and don'ts of how to talk climate with young people. And there's one for students and there's ones for kids in there. And those have been really popular with educators and with parents and caregivers.
I imagine it's helpful for scientists too. I mean, I think about many of the scientists that I come across in my work, And they have a really hard time not only explaining what they do to lay people, but explaining it to other scientists. So how do we better educate scientists about how to talk about this?
That is a great question. Science communication is a skill, and I think it's something that I'm constantly working on. The way that I talk about climate today is very different than the way I talked about it 5 years or 10 years or 20 years when I was a new climate scientist. It takes practice. So I would say be brave and go out and talk about it. For my fellow scientists out there, seek collaborations with organizations that are doing this work. I work with Climate Action Families. So that is a group that works with families, particularly with young kids. Some of the kids who came up through Climate Action Families include Audrey Piper, who is one of the plaintiffs on the Juliana case, one of the 21 young people suing the U.S. government. Jamie Margolin was also with Climate Action Families when she was a child. It's a group that is really helping foster children to find their own way in climate activism and with those emotional supports.
Well, there's a lot of doom and gloom, which you mentioned earlier. There's a lot of doom and gloom feeling, I know, from people my age. And it's hard for us to know how to explain it to our teenagers or our little ones, because part of me is very concerned about whether we're going to be around in 50 years. And that's the last thing I want to tell a young child. So what advice do you have?
Yeah, that doom and gloom is real. I hear that in my classes. I hear it from fellow adults, that fear that we're doomed. And I really try to push back on that. I think that that is one of the challenges of the climate communication, is to share the science as we know it today. Yes, we are failing, but we have not failed. The ball is rolling in the right direction to decarbonize. We need to push it faster and to help inspire each other to continue that work. And I think that Yale study that talked about how those students, and I think this goes for adults too, who are involved in climate action, collective climate action, not recycling, not changing your light bulbs, collective action with others, is really protective, because then you are moving forward. There's a video of Wangari Maathai telling a story about a hummingbird, and I encourage listeners to look that up, about how a hummingbird is going and putting out a fire and grabbing little tiny bits of water to put out the fire. And all the other animals are watching going, "You're so small. What can you do?" It's a beautiful story about how one small act can inspire others. And then all the other animals go and start helping put out the fire and quickly put it out. So that collective action really does feed hope. And I think that's what we as adults, and it helps protect the children and the youth around us, for them to see us taking action as well.
Heather Price, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, and Stephanie Desmond. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Holly Cardinale, Philip Porter, Spencer Greer, and Matthew Martin, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production support from Catherine Ricardo. Social media run by Grace Fernandez and Shian Briscoe. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.